So now we get to our main topic today here on Mastering Dungeons, and that is our pretty nifty trip through the Dungeon Master's Guide. We have gone through the first 4 chapters of this 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, and we are now moving on to chapter 5, which is Adventure Environments. So all the tables were slain in the chapter 4 NPC section, but more tables have sprung up in chapter 5.
Sure did.
So, with this chapter, we look at adventure environments. So, settings in which your adventures may take place. Here's the little opening blurb. Many D&D adventures revolve around a dungeon setting. Dungeons in D&D include great halls and tombs, subterranean monster lairs, labyrinths riddled with death traps, natural caverns extending for miles beneath the surface of the world, and ruined castles. Not every adventure takes place in a dungeon, though. A wilderness trek across the desert of desolation, a favorite of Teos and myself, are a harrowing journey journey into the jungles of the Isle of Dread can be an exciting adventure in its own right. In the great outdoors, dragons wheel across the sky in search of prey. Tribes of hobgoblins pour forth from their grim fortresses to wage war against their neighbors. Ogres plunder farmsteads for food, and monstrous spiders drop from the web-shrouded canopies of trees. So, this whole chapter talks about dungeons, and then it talks about wilderness, and it talks about urban encounters. And supposedly how to create and run them, but we'll see if we actually get into that as we go through this chapter. So, Teos, take it over from here while I have a little sip.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they try to do a good job in this dungeon section to say that what they're trying to do is say dungeon is a term we're using for a lot of things that are indoors. But they don't super say that. And actually I love this chapter a lot. So if I'm critical, overall I really like this chapter. I think it's one of the strongest ones in the book. Not that I wouldn't make some tweaks, but yeah. But the way it starts with saying dungeons are these things, and I think it's trying to paint that picture of it can be like if you look at the table, it'll say like, a building in a city. But it should, I think, it should really state that a little more clearly for my benefit to say, this is a tool set we're applying. It's a way that we're using a label for all of these very different things. And this process is going to help you really create what it should be. Don't get locked into one interpretation of what a dungeon is.
Yep. Yeah. And I think, like you say, they don't come out and say it, but they get that idea across. And then we go immediately into, okay, dungeons. Great. Let's think about dungeons. And it says
And
dungeons
let's
are
build them.
old, some dungeons. Yeah, some dungeons are old strongholds. Others are natural caves. Others attract cults and monsters and reclusive creatures. Dungeons are home to ancient treasures, and then they list many kinds of treasure, often guarded by traps or jealously kept by the monsters. I'm like, okay, cool. Yeah, that's that 4 lines, great summary. So let's talk about building a dungeon. And they're like, when you sit down to create a dungeon, think about its distinctive qualities. I'm like, yes, you should. A good adventure is at least somewhat tightly designed. Where it is and why it's there and who made it and who's there now. It all should come together. And so you should think about these distinct qualities. And then it says, let's roll on random tables to build one. And I'm like, you can totally do that, except that then takes away from this tightly knit story that you're building about why it is where it is and who created it and all of that. Now, you can still use the table and you can build that around it, but you need to do the work then of saying why it is the way it is, if it's going to make
Yeah.
sense in the adventure.
And that's where I think this is missing a statement
So,
that says, we're going to give you tables because when you're going through the process, if you hit a roadblock, a table can help you. Or you may want to roll in the tables and compare that to other ideas you have. I also think this should address the previous chapter we talked about, which is 2 chapters ago, where it was trying to sort of help you create the plot around villains and so on, it should call back to that, right? Just as that one said to come here, but it's
Mhm.
not as simple as that, right? There is a integration, as you're stating, between your plot, your villains, all of this. And so there can be a real problem if you went and did what it said in, I think, chapter 2 or 3, whichever it was, and then you start going in chapter 3, and then you start going into chapter 5, and now you end up with something that's different, right? How do you, and nothing here says how to tweak it beyond your roles properly.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And like the first thing on the chart, the dungeon location is a building in a city. And that is very different from almost everything else on
Right.
this list.
In a
The
swamp.
difference between in a swamp and in a jungle might be, yeah, it's small. The difference between, in a chasm and a building in a city is very different, right?
Right.
If
Or
the
underwater.
whole idea was I'm going to have a dragon, you're right. If I'm going to have a dragon in this, how did it get into the city? Why is it wanting to be in
Yeah.
it's but what we are going to do live or live-ish in front of you is roll a random dungeon using all of the tables that they have supplied us with. Yep, we've got dice. So Teos, roll a D100 to start us off and give us a location.
80.
80. This dungeon is on a mountain peak.
All right.
All right, so we have that going for us. So you instantly think of things like, okay, flying might be important to the creatures that live here if it's at the top of a mountain. Otherwise, they're trekking up and down this mountain constantly. We didn't roll on the exotic location table, so we will move on to the
Yeah.
dungeon creator, which is a D20, which I will roll. And I rolled
Yeah.
a 5.
And
So
can I
this
just
was
say,
made by dwarves. Yeah.
that's another example of where like that exotic location table is really cool, but I only would have rolled if I got a 96 to 00 on the dungeon location table.
Yeah.
But I think that some words there to say like these are rarer, but if that's what catches your imagination and you want to make it on a cloud, go for it, right? Like I didn't design Storm King's or Cloud Giant's bargain because I rolled a 96 to 00. It's because that was the concept. Right?
Right, exactly. And like all these tables, instead of using them as a table where you roll randomly, you use them as a pick list
Yeah.
of things that sound good. So for example, on this chart that I just rolled at, it's a D20 roll, 1 to 20. Um, so 5 to 8 is dwarves. So, a good portion of this, 20% of this is dwarves, and another 20%, 12, 13, 14, yeah, another 20% are humans.
Yeah.
So that's 40% of your dungeon creators are going to be those things if you roll randomly.
And that's
But we rolled
very
it, so we have
that's very like Forgotten Realms centric, right? It's a very like that's a certain campaign setting that leads you to that type of result and may not fit your world.
right.
All right. Dwarves
All right, so
created
we
it.
have
That's very
dwarves who created this dungeon on a mountain peak, which is sort of the opposite of what you would most dwarves you think go down into the
too far down, in
ground.
fact.
These went up.
Mm-hmm.
These went down into the mountains. So up into the mountaintop. So we didn't get exact location. Like I said, we got dungeon creator. We didn't get religious cult or group, so we don't need to roll there. Uh, there is an alignment table that if you got humans, you could roll the alignment or class. Do you want to roll the alignment and class for these dwarves just
Sure.
just for fun?
Yeah, and I because I think that this is something that might change in today's situation where you're less saying like, well, the alignment is whatever it says for dwarves to be defaulted. All right, so
Mhm.
that's a D20 roll. Whoa, that is a
A
two.
D20.
So
Bing.
they are lawful good.
Two, they're lawful good. All right. So their reasons. What I'm trying to do here is spur on our imaginations to see why they might do these things. And what's the class? I'm going to roll the class for, we'll say the leader or leaders of this.
Uh-huh.
A 15, they were sorcerers
That's
or a
perfect.
sorcerer.
Sorcerer dwarves.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So now the purpose of the dungeon is here. Well, again, 1 to 20. So Teos, I will let you do that.
I got a 19. A tomb.
It's a tomb. Nice. So the purpose was a tomb. I'm writing this down in our show notes. Purpose tomb. All right. So let's say that the sorcerer that is in question here was the one who is entombed.
And that's a great question, which is that I don't know in this process. Are we supposed to be thinking right now? Like, I don't even
Right.
like, that's the kind of thing where
Precisely.
it would be nice if the process went along with what I'm
Mhm.
supposed to be doing with it. Because I
Right.
start thinking
So
exactly like you
what
are, but
each
I
of
don't
the
know if I'm supposed to. Like,
right. Yeah. So each of these steps along the way, there should be even a short list of think about these topics.
mm-hmm.
A, think about who is in the tomb, why they were entombed where they are. So we have a tomb. Next, we have the dungeon history, which should tell us a little bit more something. I will roll this 1 to 20. That is an 8. So it was conquered by invaders.
Huh?
So after the dwarves built it, its history says conquered by invaders. And I need to learn how to spell conquered.
Hmm.
All right. So what now do we go to? That's it. That's the chart. So we don't know who the invaders are, uh,
Well, I
why
guess
they're
we can.
there.
Yeah, it doesn't have a table for inhabitants and all that after that. It just sort of stops, huh? Huh.
Yeah, it says dungeon inhabitants, and then it
Yeah.
stops. It'll probably say somewhere that you can roll random encounters. Uh, I know that in the wilderness
Mhm.
section it says that,
All right.
but it doesn't really talk about anything else in terms of getting the
Hmm.
what's there and why part of the dungeon.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I mean, so that's what we get. We get the location, the creator, the purpose, the history. We might have had, alignment and class. We could have had a few other cult or religious group things like that, but that's really kind of it. So I mean, it's not bad. I mean, certainly something you can
Mhm.
work with. A tomb on a mountain peak built by the dwarves, led by a lawful good sorcerer, conquered by some sort of invaders, and the rest we've got to do ourselves. Hmm.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think we're in the same situation here. We're looking at this going, if you're a new DM reading this, where do you go from here? Uh,
Yeah, I mean, so Dungeon
there's sections.
Inhabitants,
Yeah.
this next section then says after Dungeon's creators depart, anyone or anything might move in, and it gives some different examples if mind flyers live here or this. Um, and it says that there can be factions. Uh, think of a dungeon as a collection of encounters, but this is, I feel like suddenly there was this shift, right? Which is what we're reacting to, that we're like, okay, we're rolling this table. What's the next step in the process? And it's like suddenly we're back to like discussing thinking, and that's all fine, but it felt like a toolkit,
Mhm.
and then the toolkit suddenly abandoned us.
Right. And you can continue that toolkit with questions or suggestions, but it's just sort of a sometimes there are orcs in caves and sometimes there are mind flayers.
Yeah.
Uh, and it doesn't really give you that. Yeah, it talks about factions, dungeon factions.
Mhm.
Uh, eh, but again, that's just one of many things that could take
Yeah.
place, and not even thinking about why. So what this does is it's sort of this chapter divorces encounters from locations. It we've already read about encounters and creating them. Now we're here and like, oh look, a dungeon, a setting for your encounters, but it doesn't really talk about how putting together encounters for a dungeon would work
Right.
and what is important.
And if I try to think, Shawn, of what they might be doing, like maybe they're thinking, all right, then you go back to chapter 3 and you say your dungeon goal was, roll on the d20. Our goal was
Mhm.
hide from a threat outside the dungeon. And then I go to, what is the adventure villains? And so maybe the idea is that I should go back
Mhm.
here, but it should tell me to do that instead of saying, let's read
Precisely.
about possible dungeon inhabitants. Like what happened to this? It's like somehow it almost feels like two different people wrote this, and maybe they did, right? Maybe many different people wrote these
Mhm.
pieces. But it doesn't link back to that. And I don't know that there is any seeming logic, any apparent logic to why one chapter comes before the other, but then has NPCs in the middle, right? Like,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of bizarre. And I mean, they talk about dungeon ecology, and they make a sort of a big deal about dungeon ecology. And it's all fine, but how many years did you play before you even thought about dungeon ecology? Especially if you didn't DM and you were just a player, right?
sure.
There's always the joke about where do the monsters go to the bathroom? And that's something that's not important to me at all as a DM or as a player. I don't care. This is a magical world, of Conan and Red Sonja and Lord of the Rings and all, whatever. I am not worried about that at all. And so sure, you can talk about it, about getting food and air and water and security, but unless it really speaks to the plot of what's
Well,
going on, I don't even know if too much needs to be made about that.
I'll disagree with you a bit because I think what this is trying to do, and I think the problem here is this is a shift, not just tonal shift, but a mindset shift between outlining the concept of your dungeon and fleshing it out.
Mhm.
The concept part, which is
Mhm.
where we were, is a really important process. And I think that worked fairly well to give us some possible ideas. And we may disagree with those ideas, and it should
Mhm.
say that. If you disagree, make it your own, whatever, re-roll, change it up. But
Mhm.
we were there doing that. Then what starts happening is you have to sit down and start populating that dungeon based on these concepts. And when you
Mhm.
do that, you need to apply whatever your plot concept is, which is going back to that earlier chapter. And that's where you start going like, well, if I have 3 levels of a dungeon, it can get boring. So think about
Mhm.
factions, right? That there is the orc zone and there's the goblin zone, whatever. And think of the ecology for it. Because maybe it's good to have a river run through one part of it and everything around that area is wet, right? And that dampness brings
Mhm.
in an ecology to it that's going to really establish some verisimilitude to it because it's going to have molds and fungi and it's going to have the basilisk between the mushrooms and things like that. And the more that we put that in there, it feels really organic. um,
Mhm.
and if we do the other
Mhm.
side is,
Yeah.
near the lava, you see what I did there? That kind of thing, that
Yep.
does matter. It's not that it has to be that, these
Mhm.
creatures feed off of those creatures type of ecology, more that the dungeon environment
Right.
fits. And those are ways that that's stuff that you're applying when you get to that nitty gritty detail. Um, and
Mhm.
and that's where it's such a weird juxtaposition to suddenly hit these topics here. They're
Mhm.
good topics, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. When you say it that way, it makes sense. I think the word ecosystem got me
Mhm.
in that mindset of we're worried more about the verisimilitude
Yeah.
of the reality than we are of the story.
And they're certainly speaking
And
to that
like you
here. I
said,
mean, they do say
yeah,
that. They say like it should have internal logic. And I'm with you. I don't know that it needs that internal logic. And a little logic goes a long way. Like when you have like one offal pit, that just kind of explains that everybody poops. And we're good with that, right? Like
yeah,
we don't need 40 bathrooms. We can just, yeah, we're reminded that
yeah.
these are living things. Yep, cool. Move on.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
Then we get to mapping. And the mapping, they give some good tips. They talk about asymmetrical rooms and map layouts make the dungeon less predictable. That's always good. They say think in 3 dimensions: stairs, ramps, platforms, ledges, balconies, pits, and other changes in elevation make the dungeon more interesting. And combat, more challenging. I might push back on that a little bit. I don't think it is as interesting combat wise as people think it is. All it generally does is slow people down or make you make checks to do the things, one more check to do the things that you would normally do. So, I'm cool with having a platform and somebody up on top of the platform, but to have 27 different ledges and three, different levels for this,
I,
if you do
I'm,
that too often, yeah.
I love elevation changes. No, it's good. It's good we have these differences in
It's
some cases, but because I do, and
no,
I do
it's
hear what you're saying. It can totally be problematic
yeah.
if you spend like if you put a stairwell to get to the archers and it takes you 3 rounds to get there. That's not good, right? You've got to make it fun
Mhm.
and easy to get to these places. But otherwise, I do
Right.
really like having features to overcome like that.
The reason I say that is because for fourth edition, I was right from the start, the direction I got from Wizards was put in lots of elevation changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. Some that were very important, some that were just there for the heck of it. And as I was running these things, every once in a while it would be interesting, but for the most part, it was
Mm-hmm.
just slowing things down and making the movement, making you work for something that you would normally get for free,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and without much consequence to the overall action of the story. So
Sure. Yeah,
elevation
there's
change,
certainly,
cool
yeah,
for
there
a
are
good
pitfalls.
reason,
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. Yep. Haha. See what you did again. Uh, you say give the dungeon some wear and tear. Unless you want to stress that the dungeon's builders were extraordinarily skillful, collapsed passages can be commonplace, cutting off formerly connected sections, etc., etc. Earthquakes, splitting rooms, corridors, make interesting episodes. Totally, for sure. Good advice. Incorporate natural features into even a constructed dungeon. I feel like I'm now like building golf courses. It's like, let's use the natural landscape and the pond for it's
For
like,
this
yeah,
manicured area,
this
sure.
is cool, but right, yeah, okay, yeah. There's a mountain, and so it's built onto the mountainside, and there's a natural lava flow. Cool. That's fine.
And it's fine, but that's where I think what the real point of that, the reason why this works really well is because it breaks up monotony. And I think that's the part that's the
Mhm.
big lesson that should be here is break up the monotony, right? Like they talk about doors, and the point of these doors, like nobody cares about doors except that they do break up the action. They create pauses, they change things up. And what's
Mhm.
really good is when the door is interesting, right? But you can't have every door be interesting. And to me, those are
Mhm.
the kinds of lessons that I'd like to see here. Versus just saying like there are stuck
Right.
doors, make a check. There's a, yeah, sure, but why do I use these? When do I use these? And that's the important part.
Yep. It's sort of what we've been saying all along with most of this. It's don't just tell me what, tell me why.
Mm-hmm.
And so they say add
Agreed.
multiple entrances and exits. Nothing gives players a stronger sense of making real decisions than having multiple ways to enter the dungeon. Sure. Add secret doors and secret rooms to reward players who take the time to search for them. Maybe sometimes. What do you do if you a secret door in the first room? What happens in every single room from then on?
Mm.
We search the room, and it sort of becomes a rote thing that slows down the game. So secrets and surprises are cool, but be wary in the following ways of doing so, right? And that's not expressed there. So what did they leave out on tips for mapping a dungeon? I had a
Yeah.
couple.
Yeah. Tell me.
One is remember that gameplay and combat must actually take place in these dungeons. Prioritize the fun and effective gameplay over quote realism. If realism and fun gameplay are in conflict, ditch realism. Go with fun gameplay.
Yeah. I'm looking at you, maps from Rime of the Frost Maiden.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking for you just about every map that I made before I knew what I was doing.
I mean,
And
if your creatures and the characters don't fit in the room because there aren't enough
yes,
squares for that, come on.
yeah. Yep, you have to think these things through. Watch out for choke points like doorways and hallways. It can be fun in small doses to have the characters moving up a 5 foot wide hallway to only the people in the front and the back can engage with the monsters that have surrounded them, and everyone in melee, everyone else is firing over or doing certain things. It can be fun once. It can be fun twice. But when every single time the doorway gets jammed up, so that only one person can fight and no one can get into access, it it becomes a drag.
Yeah.
Any other tips that
Pacing,
you can think
right? I
of
mean,
for?
pacing is such a
Yeah.
huge thing that with a dungeon, like if you just have like cell after cell that you're supposed to investigate, or Expedition to the Barrier Peaks is probably the best example, where there are levels that just have tons of tiny rooms with nothing
Mhm.
in them but like skeletons over and over and over again, and it gets so old. Anytime you have that, right, you need to step back and think, what am I doing here? And it's
Mhm.
fine to say that there should be many inhabitants, but then just explain that this whole thing is a zone, and the action only happens in this place, right? Think of the
Yeah.
pacing of it, how it's going to play out.
Great idea. Think of the size of your typical battle map. If you run on a
Mm.
grid and your battle map is 30 by 30, don't make your dungeon so big that you can't fit it on that battle map.
There's some things
So
that there are a lot
I've
of
I've
things here.
I've run.
Go ahead, Sean.
I was just gonna say I've run several adventures where the map as it's laid out is just like two squares too wide or two squares too high, and I'm like, why?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking that in Forge of Foes, we have a number of articles in this book that we wrote about how to make interesting encounters. And I know this goes back into the encounter piece, but it really does matter when you're thinking about the dungeon overall to work off of these themes and incorporate these themes into things and how you change it up. So, for example, we talk about playing against expectations, right? So, if you have something like a water elemental in a lava area, and why? And
Mhm.
those kinds of things wake
Yep.
up players, right? So doing things, because the whole, and what's missing here throughout this is you are creating an experience. It's almost like you're creating a movie,
Mhm.
right? You're creating a novel. Like you are plotting this out, and the point is to make this awesome. So you need to have things that are going to periodically cause introspection, right? Like it talks about hazards, but puzzles, not everybody loves puzzles,
Mhm.
but some people do. A proportion of people really do, and it changes the action. And even the person who doesn't like the puzzle can sit back and get a little bit of a break, and then we go to a combat, right? So that kind of dynamic of pacing,
Mhm.
of changing up what you're involving, that's really critical in this.
Yep. And what this really sums up as is you are going to have to iterate between the maps you make and the encounters and adventures that you put on that map. Because you can make the map first, but you're going to find out that, oh, this room would be a lot more interesting if, because there's a lich here, I put an area where the lich can hide for a round or two. So I need to make that change. Or, oh, I'm going to have four huge monsters in this room. I need to expand this room a bit. And it's okay. And you're going to do that multiple times as you go from your map to your adventure to your map to your adventure to your map to your adventure. And that's okay. Don't be tied to either aspect, because otherwise you're going to be either frustrated yourself or frustrate your players once the adventure starts.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I think that would be a good place to end because next time we can talk about wilderness and mapping wilderness and settlements and making urban adventures and encounters and traps and so on and so on and so on. Anything to add before we take off, Teos?
No, I mean, I think this again, it has really neat ideas, and I think it's a valuable piece to read. It just isn't a process, which is a thing we've seen throughout this book. It could be a better process for today's audience, and hopefully the
Mhm.
revised 2024 version will look at that and give us more of that.
For sure. So thank you, Teos, for your expertise here. And thank you to our listeners. If you are a patron of the show, we thank you specifically. Thank you to our Master of Dungeon supporters. Thank you also to our Masters of the Realms who get listed in our show notes. And to our Masters of the Multiverse patrons, well, you get a special shout out. Keith Ammon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Evil John, Darren Chandler, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Brian King, Jim Klingler, aka DM Prime Mover, Travis Lee, Chad Lynch, the Mathemagician, Eric Mingy, the Micro Ant, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Ross Sandberg, Krishna Simone, say it again, Joe Tyler, James Walton, and Graham Ward. Thank you to our listeners and our patrons. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/mastering D&D. And we very much appreciate your support. I may even throw a video up just for patrons talking about a very important topic that Merrick Blackman brought up.
Mm.
Uh, so you can also give us a review on Apple Podcasts. That would help us with our optics there. And you can subscribe via YouTube if you want to engage with us that way. So, Teos, where can people find you on the intro webs?
Oh, yeah. Head to alphastream.org. There you will see that the top post is all about the latest YouTube video I have for success in RPGs. It is how to use the Open Gaming License in 7 pretty easy steps, but why you might want to use it or not use it as well. So that's important. You can find me from there and all the other socials and stuff. Shawn, where do we find you?
Well, I want to know how to use the OGL. So I'm going to be there first. But then after I read all about that, you can find me on Twitter or on Mastodon at Shawn Merwin. The podcast is also on Twitter at Mastering DND and also on Mastodon at Dicecamp. You can join our community and ask questions by joining our Patreon that we've already talked about. And you can leave comments on our Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel, YouTube at Mastering Dungeons. So, Teos, now that we know all there is to know about dungeons and mapping them, what are we going to do now?
Let's see. It
Oh,
looks like I'm going to go build a temple or shrine.
are you? I'm going to explore that mountaintop tomb of the dwarven sorcerer, fighting my way through the invaders to figure out what's going on there.
Mounted top tomb of the dwarven sorcerer. Band or album?
Both.